After coming out of a difficult 3-year marriage, all 23-year-old Staff Sergeant Rachel McFarland wanted was a peaceful home in which to raise her 14-month-old son.
I was in the Air Force in Oklahoma City, and my marriage to my ex-husband was tumultuous, to say the least. So I didn't really give a whole lot of thought to dating.
So Rachel was surprised when one night in the spring of 2004, she found herself at a small party enjoying a conversation with a 25-year-old man named Daryl Wilson.
Daryl and I were talking, and I noticed that he was very soft-spoken. He seemed kind-hearted, just a nice guy.
As the two shared stories, Rachel couldn't believe how much they had in common.
We each had a child from a previous marriage. They were just 6 years apart. And we wore the same perfume cologne, his and hers.
Would it be weird if I asked for his number?
No, it's 555. At the end of the night, Rachel felt good about the chance encounter.
I'd had a rotten couple of years, and I warmed to the idea of spending time with a guy that I thought was normal.
A few days later, Daryl called Rachel, and the two set up a movie date at her house.
I could tell he was super nervous. I thought it was pretty endearing.
Rachel learned Daryl worked at the nearby water department and had also come from a difficult marriage.
She got married pretty young.
He told me that they fought constantly, and she told him she wanted a divorce, and that crushed Daryl. I could see how much he was hurt, and I thought to myself, this is a really good guy.
Things are better.
Over the next year, the two continued dating, eventually introducing their children to one another.
Daryl was completely different in every respect from my previous marriage. We did normal, fun things. Daryl and I were just kind of moving along at a steady pace, and that was great.
By August 2005, the couple decided it was time to upgrade to a home where they could all live together comfortably.
I was extremely happy to see Rachel happy. And Rachel and Daryl seemed to get along just great.
Even so, there were a few hurdles to get through.
What is this?
Filling out our mortgage papers.
Daryl had declared bankruptcy, so the mortgage had to be in my name.
I should be the one writing the family, not you.
He really disliked that. And I couldn't understand why it bothered him so much. But I think it was kind of like an affront to his manhood.
It's okay, I'll take care of it.
I operate almost entirely on logic, and Daryl was much more emotional about things. But I wasn't worried. It seemed like things were going so well.
That fall, after a year and a half together, the two exchanged vows in a private wedding ceremony.
I felt like I was walking on clouds. I believed that I couldn't possibly love anyone more than I loved him.
I was thanking God that she finally had someone that cared about her and cared about her child, and I was happy for her.
Unfortunately, after Daryl quit his job at the water department, a new side to his personality began to emerge.
Daryl really hated it, so Daryl's brother hired him on as a carpenter. Daryl knew basic carpentry, but I guess this was a lot more specialized. So Daryl would come home from work, stressed out.
And when I come home, I just want a clean house. Just please get this cleaned up.
It was extremely confusing because his normal persona was so gentle.
Soon, Rachel would see her dream of a peaceful home life turn into more tragedy than anyone could have possibly imagined.
He just went crazy.
I never thought in my worst nightmares this would happen.
Rachel, you don't want me, you don't love me, you don't give two about me.
I couldn't scream because he would kill us all.
After 2 months of marriage, Rachel Wilson struggled to comprehend what had changed in her husband, Daryl.
He was so mild-mannered, and now he's just really stressed out with his new job.
I want to come home. I don't want to be tripping over toys all day.
So any negative emotion for him manifested in anger. He was like typical Jekyll and Hyde.
As the holiday season approached, Daryl's mood only got worse.
We were at my squadron Christmas ball, and he was arms crossed, scowling.
Hey man, what's up?
People would say hi to him, and he wouldn't even acknowledge that they were speaking to him. He was incredibly rude. It was embarrassing to me. And right then, at that moment, I knew I had to make a break because I'm not gonna put up with it. Not after the first marriage. I'm not doing it.
Rachel felt she had no choice but to kick Daryl out that night.
She was embarrassed. She didn't want to get another divorce, and she didn't know what to do, but that's what she thought was best.
Over the next few months, Daryl called Rachel several times to reconcile. But it wasn't until April 2006 when he actually apologized.
I'm so sorry. You were right. I was being a jerk. I miss you.
I was so incredibly happy. That really impressed me. It seemed more genuine.
Before Rachel knew it, their makeup sessions resulted in their first pregnancy. Daryl moved back in, and initially, it seemed he'd turned a new leaf.
His anger level did seem to be much more under control.
I'll take care of this.
After the birth of their daughter, Rachel was pleased when Daryl proved himself a doting new father. By 2010, life only got better for the couple when they welcomed a baby boy, and Daryl landed a federal job with the Department of Defense.
How are you?
I think he felt good. There was a big bump in pay, and then there were great benefits. It was a very happy time.
Sadly, it wouldn't last. Daryl's new job only seemed to stress him out more than ever, as he quickly reverted to his former self.
Rachel, are you stupid? This place is a mess. You clean all day. Is that what you...
Daryl's anger took an abrupt upswing.
It soon became obvious to Rachel that the marriage was over.
Every day, it was just like a pit of misery.
In 2011, after 6 years of marriage, the couple formally separated.
I know he felt as badly as I did about what a separation between us would do to the kids, but he found somewhere else to live, and we made it work. It felt so amazing with him gone.
That spring, Rachel decided to get out of the house and joined one of her friends at a local nightclub, and was glad she did.
I ended up talking to this guy.
The 23-year-old introduced himself as Bill Schnittman and explained he was an Olympic trainee at the nearby facility for rowers.
We talked pretty much the rest of the night, and I was just happy to have a diversion. He was super funny and really, really cute.
Rachel thought it was just friendly flirtation, so she was shocked when Bill asked her out to lunch.
We stretched lunch into a couple of hours. I found myself feeling kind of lighthearted and excited. He was amazing.
Bill just made Rachel feel like living life. I can see her free spirit coming back.
As Rachel and Bill grew closer, her newfound happiness was impossible to hide. And over the next year, Daryl became increasingly suspicious that she was seeing someone. Even though they planned to officially file for divorce, Daryl remained possessive of her and began calling and texting Rachel incessantly.
He would either be talking about how I was the love of his life, or I was spawn of Satan, and it struck me as really creepy and really out of character for him.
One fateful morning in August 2012, Daryl took his disturbing new behavior one step further.
I spent the night, and when Bill and I got up the next morning, we decided to take a walk. I saw Daryl charging up the front lawn. It was more just shock. Bill had never met him before, and I was scared about what Daryl's intentions were. I figured Bill just wouldn't answer the door, but he did.
In August 2012, Rachel Wilson's boyfriend Bill Schnittman came face to face for the first time with her estranged husband, Daryl.
I didn't think about running, I just did it, and I was scared about what his intentions were. Bill answered the door, and I could sort of hear them talking.
What are you doing? Where's Rachel?
And Bill kept telling him he needed to leave, and Daryl wouldn't.
I want to talk to her. Rachel! Get out of here! Right now!
He just stood there and kept yelling.
Fuming, Daryl took off.
Bill and I both believed that he was going to go back to just being a big a-hole. He'd always been such a normal, boring guy. And we were waiting for him to go back to his normal, boring existence.
Daryl had another plan.
He started tracking me everywhere that I went. He wasn't going to work because he was tracking me around the clock. And that creeped me out bad.
When I learned Daryl was stalking her, I was scared for Rachel's life because at that point he was not very stable.
Soon, Daryl turned his anger toward Bill.
Daryl got Bill's name, and after that, he started Googling Bill. I mean, just everything there was to find about him. He found it.
And it wasn't long before Bill began receiving vulgar, threatening messages from Daryl. By December of 2012, Rachel and Bill couldn't take it anymore, and they both filed protective orders against him.
Daryl was threatening her and Bill continually, and obviously they knew that their lives were in danger and they were really trying to do whatever they could to prevent it.
While Rachel's protective order was approved on behalf of her and her children, Bill's, unfortunately, was not.
Bill would have been granted one, but he somehow made a clerical error, didn't include the right document, and that's why it was denied. But for a man to file a victim protective order against another man is highly unusual.
I was concerned that Daryl would just continue harassing them. That's not normal behavior.
Rachel and Bill also started tracking and recording Daryl's calls and messages.
You're worthless, and I can't stand it at all. Person that would do this to somebody. You're all that matters to me. Do you not understand? I hate you. I love you so much.
I was looking over my shoulder all the time. I was in such a high state of anxiousness.
Then, by the end of December, it seemed Daryl had finally come to his senses.
Daryl sent me an email, and he apologized for his crazy behavior, and then he said, I should have left you alone. It took forever, but this is gonna stop. It was like I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that felt really, really good.
Rachel and Bill went to bed that night, feeling the worst was finally behind them. But they couldn't have been more wrong. In the early morning hours of December 21st, 2012, Rachel Wilson and her boyfriend Bill Schnittman were under attack.
The next thing I was aware of was shouting and gunfire. Daryl fired several shots and hit Bill twice, in the hand and the shoulder.
Before Rachel could even react, Bill sprang into action despite his injuries.
Bill was fighting with Daryl at the door of the room. Nothing was making any sense. I saw Bill on the floor, and I couldn't understand how he got there. and there was blood all over the bed, and I realized that my left hand had a gunshot wound in it. And then Daryl pointed the gun at Bill's head.
See what you did? Did you see what you did?
I knew, no matter what, that I couldn't scream because I couldn't let the kids wake up. If they did, I knew he would kill us all. I couldn't panic, and I knew if he wanted me dead, I was gonna die. He put me in the car, and then he'd rape me.
Take it. I'll take it right now.
He handed me his phone and told me to type what he dictated.
This is my last night on earth. My wife doesn't love me anymore. My happiness. And now it's all over.
It was a very long and rambling suicide note.
Daryl made her post the note to his Facebook page. Luckily, someone who saw the message called 911.
When police arrived there, they were actually in the driveway. He was holding a gun to her head.
At that moment, I thought, I'm dead. The police are here. He's going to kill me now. And instead, he said,
Get out! Get out!
Suddenly, Daryl took off.
Officers quickly followed in pursuit. Meanwhile, Rachel was placed in the police cruiser.
I could hear over the police radio details of the chase.
He's at the overpass.
He's hit 124.
With all this chaos and all this horror around me, I was in shock. I couldn't function. And then I saw them bring Bill out on a stretcher. He was still alive. I knew that he'd made it this far. He's hurt really bad, but he's going to be okay. And at the same time, they brought my kids out. And it was just this flood of relief. Daryl shot himself in the head. I heard that he was still alive, and I thought, oh my gosh.
It was a very gruesome scene on the interstate, and trying to reason what he did, there is no reason for it. You can't explain obsession and craziness. He had a goal, and there was nothing that was going to stop him.
As officers processed the crime scene, Rachel was taken to the nearest hospital while her children stayed with law enforcement.
The gunshot wound itself was pretty straightforward to repair, and then a police officer came in and told me that Daryl had died. I didn't even have time to feel anything.
Later that day, Rachel received more horrible news. Bill had also passed.
That, by far, was the absolute worst. It was worse than seeing him shot. Inside my head, I was just screaming. I don't think I'd ever felt more alone.
Rachel, she was broken. She was just devastated. She really loved Bill. She didn't know what to do without Bill.
Overcome with everything that happened, Rachel thought back to her relationship with Daryl.
There were a lot of things with Daryl that were huge red flags that I didn't give a proper weight. The fact that he was married before, and it ended badly. And I knew he had experienced quite a bit of rejection in his life. And he was not able to control his emotions. And I think Daryl felt like he was being replaced by a younger, handsome man. But I didn't understand what can happen in someone when they lose control.
Today, Rachel still feels overwhelming guilt about Bill's tragic murder.
It's impossible to not constantly say to yourself, if only I'd been able to get help sooner. It was eating me alive, but nothing I could have done could have saved him.
I still worry about Rachel. She is working towards being happy again, but it is going to take time.
Since Bill's death, Rachel has moved her children back to Iowa.
All of this has obviously changed me forever. There's no way it couldn't. But having the kids to focus on That helps me a lot.
By the time Shauna Williams turned 40, she was used to starting over. After getting pregnant and married at the young age of 20, Shauna and her husband had settled in Goldsboro, North Carolina.
We were married very young. We stayed married 8 years. Decided to go in separate directions.
So in 2004, when a family member in Richmond, Virginia became ill and needed her support, Shauna found herself freshly divorced and planting new roots with her daughter, Lauren.
I was working full-time as a medical assistant. I just started going to school, but I did still miss the family and friends that we left behind in North Carolina. So we would travel back on weekends and holidays.
On one of her visits in April 2009, Shauna was thrilled when she heard from her old friend, Sean Williams.
Actually, I'm in town this weekend, and I was wondering if you wanted to hook up and grab a drink or something.
I remembered Sean because he went to high school with my brother. It had just been such a long time since we had seen each other, but I was looking forward to catching up.
How about coffee? Everybody meets for coffee now. That'd be great.
Yeah, coffee would be nice.
Now an active duty Army Staff Sergeant stationed in Fort Gordon, Georgia, Sean had clearly transformed into a man.
He gotten a lot taller, a little more distinguished.
And he was about to surprise Shauna with a tender confession.
He told me how much he missed me and told me that he's been in love with me since he was 15.
I know. I just knew one day that you'd be my wife.
It was very flattering.
It's the first day.
But I didn't feel attracted to Sean.
But Sean, I don't know.
He really wasn't my type.
Still, when she returned to Richmond, Shauna found herself chatting with her Army admirer almost every night.
The more I learned about Sean and what his goals and his dreams were, I realized that they were very similar to mine.
I want to travel, buy a house, settle down.
I want the same things too, you know?
And I started looking at him differently.
Soon, Sean was making regular visits from Fort Gordon to Richmond to visit Shauna.
Things happened pretty fast. The times that we did spend together were amazing, and we just agreed that we wanted to take it to the next level.
Would you consider getting married again?
Oh, yeah. I get married again.
Really?
Yeah.
I really felt that Sean made Mom happy. Just the look on her face, she was smiling more often and just seemed really bubbly. So I was like, okay, that's good.
After her experience of getting pregnant at a young age, Shauna was determined not to take any chances.
So Sean and I made a mutual agreement that we would not be intimate prior to our wedding night. And we both decided to have STD testing done prior to the wedding.
A few days later, Sean arrived in Richmond for their big day.
I showed Sean my test results, and he said that his tests were negative.
You know, the military, they test us every 3 months, so.
And I was okay with that.
I love you. Love you back.
After nearly 7 months together, Shauna Williams married Sean Williams, and she didn't even have to change her name.
I was happy for her. She had finally found someone that I knew was a good person and she could build a life with.
I couldn't wait to spend the rest of my life with him. I was the happiest I had ever been.
But her happiness wouldn't last long. When Shauna learned what lay beneath her husband's charming facade had the power to kill.
This is the kind of thing that you only see on television.
It was devastating. I mean, it was just gut-wrenching.
On September 3rd, 2009, Shauna Williams was excited to finally consummate her marriage with new husband, Army Sergeant Sean Williams.
Our wedding day was so special, and honestly, we were just exhausted. The big night that we were waiting for just didn't happen that night. And it didn't happen the next night, and the next night. And I would ask Sean, well, what's going on?
Honey, is everything okay?
He had said that he's waited for this since he was 15, and he was nervous.
I don't want to mess things up.
So we just took our time and waited until it just felt right for both of us.
Shortly after their wedding, Sean asked Shauna to move to Georgia, where he was stationed, leaving Shauna torn.
After discussing it, we both agreed that because I was still in school, that it would be best for me to stay in Richmond until after I graduated.
2 years.
It's gonna be a long 2 years. And I'm gonna
miss the hell out of you, but we'll be fine.
In the meantime, their love, trust, and frequent visits would sustain them. Sean always found sweet ways to stay connected with Shauna, even when he was working late at his second job as a bouncer at a local karaoke bar.
Sean would send funny pictures and text messages and would always tell me how much he missed me and how much he loved me.
But when graduation came and went, Shauna was dismayed to find Sean no longer seemed to view her move to Georgia as an urgent matter.
You're never gonna be able to find a job here. You should probably stay in Richmond.
It kind of struck me as a little strange, seeing as how we were still newlyweds. I just figured maybe it was the stress of his career.
Shauna found herself regretting her decision not to move to Georgia right away, especially when military life became even busier for Sean over the next few months.
I was disappointed. Sean didn't visit Richmond as much. The conversations we had on the phone had dwindled somewhat.
Call me back.
Shauna was kind of let down by that. She was wondering whether or not, he still wanted to be married, if there was something going on.
To her major relief, Sean seemed to regain his fire for her when he received a permanent change in station to Fort Bliss, Texas, and was able to get them off-post housing. On April 10th, 2012, Shauna was finally able to move in with her husband.
Mom was the happiest I've ever seen her. She was getting ready to start the next chapter of her life with her husband, so she was happy.
Shauna counted her blessings until one day that May.
Sean was not the neatest person in the world, so I wanted to clean his car while he was at work and throwing away the bottles and potato chip bags.
Shauna was all too happy to be doing the things she felt a good wife should do, until she stumbled upon something that would make her think twice.
I see something sticking out the driver's side door. I was speechless. I didn't know what to believe.
Oh my God.
That was the beginning of her nightmare.
In the spring of 2012, while cleaning out her husband Sean's car, Shauna Williams was shocked at what she found.
I noticed that there was a box of condoms on the driver's side door. And we're a newly married couple that didn't use condoms.
What the hell are these?
And he said that they were in the car that he had purchased before, and things from that car just got transferred to this car. It was just a mistake.
Shauna wasn't sure what to think, but decided to keep an eye out for anything else suspicious before jumping to conclusions. So over the next few months, Shauna focused on integrating herself into Sean's life.
Sean suggested we have some of his military colleagues over for dinner and drinks. And I figured that this was a perfect opportunity for me to experience being a military wife.
The party was going swimmingly
So glad you were able to make it. It's so nice to meet you.
until Sean left to give someone a ride home.
I noticed that Sean left his phone. It started to ring. I just assumed that it was him looking for his phone. So I picked it up.
Hello?
And it was a woman.
I'm looking for Sean. Who is this?
This is Sean's wife. Who is this?
She immediately hung up.
She just had this nagging feeling that there was something going on. So she went through his phone.
There were numerous text messages and pictures of other women. He's proposing to other women. I found pictures of half-naked women. Everything that Sean told me, he's now telling multiple other women. I was floored.
When Sean returned home a few minutes later, Shauna was hell-bent on finding out just what was going on.
I think I just left my phone.
Oh yeah, you left your phone, all right. And you're not gonna get it back, Sean, until you tell me what the hell is going on.
Whoa, what are you talking about?
What do you mean, what am I talking about?
I said, no, you need to explain why these text messages and these photos are in your phone. Sean admitted that the text messages were very inappropriate and said that he decided to entertain other conversations until I moved from Richmond.
What happened again?
He said, please don't leave me. I love you. I'm sorry. It was wrong.
It was stupid, but I swear to God, I was lonely.
As difficult as it was, Shauna decided to try and forgive her husband.
I loved my husband, and I wanted this to work and was willing to confront it, correct him, but to just move on.
Still, as much as Shauna wanted to move past what she had found, she simply couldn't. The idea of catching Sean in his lies consumed her.
I turned into an investigator. I went through his personal items looking for any sign that this behavior is still going on.
It wasn't until that July, while Sean was at work, when Shauna spotted something suspicious.
The papers were stuffed in the glove compartment. So I went in the bathroom with the papers.
And the very first words Shauna read, there in black and white, knocked the breath right out of her.
I was stunned. I was floored.
This man is a sociopath and a predator.
I couldn't breathe. I started to shake. I think in that moment, my heart stopped.
In July of 2012, Shauna Williams stumbled upon something shocking in her husband's car.
I saw that they were medical records. 2 words on those medical records jumped out at me. They were herpes and HIV.
Not only did Sean have HIV, but he had known his status for 6 years.
You know, the military, they test us every 3 months.
The medical records dated back to 2006, 3 years before we were married. I couldn't breathe. I started to shake.
Shauna was determined to be tested as soon as possible.
My initial HIV test was done at the military hospital. When I asked how long it would take, they said 10 days, which was gonna be the longest 10 days of my life.
The next several hours were a blur as Shauna met with military lawyers and investigators to report her husband's deception.
One of the questions the military personnel asked was if I had knowledge of anyone else that Sean was involved with.
Having sexual relations with anybody else?
And I remembered then that I still had his phone.
Military police brought Sean to headquarters while they investigated and placed him in military barracks.
All I thought about was, oh my God, am I going to die? And I was scared, more scared than I've ever been in my life.
Finally, after 10 days, Shauna learned her test results.
She said, you're HIV negative. And I was so relieved.
But relief soon turned to fear when Shauna remembered it could take up to a year for the virus to develop.
This means you do need continued testing.
Okay. As Shauna tried to come to grips with what had happened, she couldn't help but pore over her history with Sean.
The fact that I had my lab results and that he didn't have his, the condoms in his car, the multiple text messages and pictures. Looking back, the red flags were there. I think my heart just chose not to pick up on them.
Shauna had so many questions, and in late August, she finally had the chance to ask Sean through a military-arranged meeting.
Why would you do this to me? To me?
Because I love you, Shauna, and I didn't want to lose you.
He still stuck to his story that he was never unfaithful.
I don't believe you.
I'm telling you the truth.
Unfortunately, holding Sean accountable would prove to be a long and daunting process. It wasn't until November 2013 when Shauna finally heard from a JAG prosecutor. Thanks to the contents of Sean's phone, they'd been able to confirm Sean had failed to inform 7 other women of his HIV status. One of his victims, Alicia Clark, met him in 2009 in Georgia.
I first met Sean when I had gone out to a local karaoke bar. He started flirting with me, and over the course of a few weeks, he got a little more persistent. You know, he started walking me to my car. He would tell me that he was in love with me and that he wanted to marry me.
You're the love of my life.
We started discussing things possibly being taken to a physical level. So I asked him, how often are you tested for STDs?
Oh, I get the military, they test me every 3 months.
Oh.
We were all shocked. I think Sean went into the military, and when he realized how much women like a man in uniform, he just went off the deep end.
Luckily, none of the women were infected, but there was no telling how many more had been exposed. On September 9th, 2014, Sean Williams pleaded guilty to 8 counts of aggravated assault, 6 counts of adultery, and 1 count of disobeying direct orders. He was dishonorably discharged from the Army and received an 8-year federal prison sentence.
It was very hurtful and emotional to know that someone that I fell in love with deeply could hurt me in such a devastating way.
Today, Shauna is starting over again. Even though for the last 2 years she has tested negative for HIV, her ordeal still weighs heavily on her.
I'm different. I don't easily trust people the way that I used to.
But with each day, Shauna believes that God spared her health and gave her strength to live her life to the fullest.
Shauna's made a lot of steps moving forward. I'm noticing a calmness coming over her, and she's starting to smile a little bit more.
Life today is much better. And I have a wonderful, supportive family, and my friends have been amazing. And with that network that I have, it can't get anything but better.
The air in 1990 California didn't smell like fear. It smelled like jasmine, salt air, and the false promise of suburban safety. It was the era of unlocked back doors and children cycling until the streetlights flickered to life. But in one quiet cul-de-sac, the silence didn't signal peace. It signaled a void that would take 34 years to fill. This is not just a story of a crime. It is the anatomy of a 34-year lie. A mask worn so perfectly it became a second skin, and a cold case that froze the heart of a community until the heat of modern science finally set the truth on fire. The sun was dipping low over the horizon on that Tuesday in June. The shadows of the palm trees stretched like long, thin fingers across the pavement. 7-year-old Chloe Henderson was supposed to be home for dinner. Her blue bicycle was found leaning against the white picket fence of a neighboring yard. The chain still warm, the tassels on the handlebars fluttering in the breeze. No struggle, no scream, just an empty space where a child used to be. The neighborhood didn't just lose a girl that night. It lost its soul. The panic was immediate, a frantic, jagged energy that surged through the streets. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Neighbors called out her name until their voices cracked. And at the center of the chaos was the man everyone turned to. Arthur Vance, the man next door. The man who held Chloe's mother as she collapsed on the lawn. The man who organized the search parties. The trusted neighbor, with the steady hand and the grieving eyes. For weeks, the investigation was a whirlwind of dead ends. Detectives combed through every inch of the surrounding woods. Divers murkied the waters of the local reservoir. And the FBI moved in with their suits and their grim expressions. They looked at the drifters, the outsiders, the men with records who lived on the fringes of town. They never looked at the man who brought the officers coffee every morning. Arthur Vance was a pillar, a handyman who fixed the neighborhood's leaky faucets, a coach who taught the local kids how to swing a bat, a man who seemed to hurt as much as the Hendersons did. But beneath the veneer of the helpful neighbor, a predator was breathing the same air as his hunters. The case went cold not for lack of effort, but because the monster was hidden in plain sight, camouflaged by the very trust he had meticulously cultivated. Decades passed. The 90s bled into the 2000s. Technology evolved from grainy VHS tapes to digital clarity, but the Henderson case remained a ghost in the filing cabinet. Chloe's parents moved away, unable to bear the sight of the empty park across the street. The neighborhood changed. New families moved in, unaware that they were walking on ground stained by an unsolved nightmare. Arthur Vance stayed. He grew older, his hair silvering, his reputation as the kind old man on the corner solidified. He was the grandfather figure to a new generation, the man who still kept his lawn pristine and his secrets buried deeper than the roots of his ancient oak trees. The files sat in the basement of the precinct, gathering dust, labeled with that haunting phrase, cold case, until a single microscopic thread of the past was pulled, and the entire tapestry of Vance's life began to unravel. The breakthrough didn't come from a sudden confession or a new witness. It came from the silent testimony of DNA. In 1990, forensic science was a blunt instrument. In the mid-2020s, it became a scalpel. A cold case task force, armed with genetic genealogy, revisited the preserved evidence from Chloe's bicycle. A faint, almost invisible biological trace on the rubber grip. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They didn't find a direct match in the criminal database. Instead, they found a cousin, then a second cousin. The digital web began to tighten, tracing a lineage back to a small family tree in California. The investigators followed the branches, their hearts racing as the names narrowed down. When the name Arthur Vance appeared on the screen, the room went silent. The man who helped search for her, the man who wept at her memorial, the man who had lived a normal, quiet life for 34 years while a child's blood was on his hands. The surveillance began in secret. They watched him buy groceries. They watched him water his plants. They waited for a discarded item, a piece of trash that carried his code. When Vance tossed a coffee cup into a public bin, the trap snapped shut. The lab results were indisputable. The trusted neighbor was a ghost no longer. The arrest sent a shockwave through the community that felt like an earthquake. People stood on their porches, watching in stunned silence as the elderly man was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of calculated confusion. The dark secret was out. The basement of his home, once thought to be a simple workshop, revealed the horrors of a hidden life, trophies of a tragedy kept for decades. As the sirens faded into the distance, the weight of 34 years of deception hung heavy in the air. The cold case was closed, but the chill remained. It was a reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it looks like the man who offers you a hand when you're falling. The resolution brought a grim justice to the Henderson family, a closure that felt more like a scar than a healing. The mystery was gone, replaced by the haunting reality that for over 3 decades, a killer had been the heartbeat of the very street he had haunted. The silence in that California suburb is different now. It's the silence of a truth finally told, a secret finally bared, and a little girl whose name is no longer a question, but a legacy of a justice that never, ever gave up. The handcuffs didn't just bind Arthur Vance's wrists. They shattered the very foundation of a neighborhood built on the bedrock of collective trust. As the patrol cars pulled away, leaving behind the acrid scent of burnt rubber and the flickering blue and red ghosts of emergency lights, the residents of Oak Street stood paralyzed. This wasn't supposed to happen here. This wasn't the cold case from a distant city or a gritty crime novel. This was the man who had flipped burgers at their 4th of July block parties. This was the man who had fixed the broken latch on the Hendersons' gate just days after Chloe disappeared. The very latch he had likely slipped through to take her. The shock was a physical weight, a suffocating realization that for 34 years, they hadn't been living next to a neighbor, but a predator who used their grief as his ultimate cover. Inside the interrogation room, the air was stale, stripped of the jasmine-scented California breeze Vance had enjoyed for 3 decades. He sat there, a frail-looking 70-year-old man, still wearing his world's greatest grandpa sweater, his eyes projecting a calculated brand of bewildered innocence. But the detectives across from him weren't looking at the old man. They were looking at the 1990 monster hidden beneath the wrinkles. The cold case file lay open on the table, its yellowed pages a stark contrast to the high-definition DNA reports that now pinned him to the crime. They pushed a photograph across the table, a picture of 7-year-old Chloe, her smile frozen in time, a time Arthur Vance had stolen. He didn't flinch. He didn't weep. He stared at the image with a chilling, clinical detachment that made the lead investigator's blood run cold. The investigation into Vance's dark secret was only beginning. While he sat in silence, a forensic team in white Tyvek suits descended upon his pristine home like a swarm of methodical locusts. They weren't just looking for evidence of Chloe. They were looking for the history of a man who had successfully deleted his own darkness. The floorboards were pulled up, the garden, the one he had tended so lovingly for years, was excavated with ground-penetrating radar. Every corner of that house was a potential archive of agony. Neighbors watched from behind drawn curtains as bags of evidence were carried out. Old journals, rolls of undeveloped film from the early 90s, and most disturbingly, a collection of small, feminine trinkets that didn't belong to any of his known relatives. The trusted neighbor had been a collector, keeping trophies of his hunt within arm's reach of his bed. As the forensic sweep deepened, the cold case began to bleed into other unsolved disappearances. Detectives started cross-referencing Vance's travel history, his old job sites, and his movements across the state during the late 80s and early 90s. The terrifying possibility emerged that Chloe wasn't his only victim, merely the one who finally tripped the wire of fate. The community's shock morphed into a visceral, retrospective terror. Mothers who had let their children play in Vance's yard, who had thanked him for his kindness, were now gripped by a retroactive panic, realizing they had invited a wolf into their sanctuary. The betrayal wasn't just his. It was a betrayal of their own intuition, a reminder that the most dangerous monsters don't growl, they smile. The dark secret, finally revealed, wasn't just a single act of violence, but a lifetime of meticulously maintained camouflage. Vance had been a master of the ordinary. He had studied the mechanics of being a good neighbor like a foreign language, perfecting the nuances of empathy and the timing of a well-placed "how are you?" To ensure he remained above suspicion, he had used the search for Chloe to stay informed of the police's progress, standing in the very briefings where detectives discuss their lack of leads. He was the cold case architect, building a fortress of normalcy out of the bricks of his neighbor's trust. But as the sun set on the first day of his arrest, that fortress was a ruin, and the man inside it was finally, irrevocably exposed to the harsh light of a justice that had been 34 years in the making. The silence of the Vance household was always its most inviting quality, a peaceful sanctuary at the end of a bustling street. But as the forensic team breached the threshold of the master bedroom, that silence began to scream. Every step on the hardwood floor echoed like a heartbeat in a hollow chest. They moved past the framed photos of a life that never happened, stock images of a man who looked like a grandfather but felt like a void. It was in the back of the walk-in closet, behind a wall of perfectly pressed flannel shirts, that a technician noticed the anomaly. A seam in the baseboard that didn't quite meet the floor. A subtle, mechanical resistance when pushed. With the turn of a hidden latch disguised as a simple coat hook, the back wall didn't just open. It exhaled a draft of cold, stagnant air that had been trapped since the Bush administration. This was the dark secret, in its most physical form. A hidden room, no larger than a cell, soundproofed with thick, decaying foam and illuminated by a single, flickering bulb that hummed with a low, electrical anxiety. The air here was heavy with the smell of dust and something metallic, something old. On a small wooden desk sat a neat row of Polaroids, their colors faded to a sickly sepia, capturing the final, terrified moments of lives that had been erased from the map. The cold case was no longer a mystery. It was a museum of misery. Investigators found a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with Vance's cramped, precise handwriting, dates, times, weather patterns, and the exact moment the light left his victim's eyes. He hadn't just committed these crimes. He had curated them, treating his atrocities like a hobby he could revisit whenever the trusted neighbor mask felt too heavy to wear. As the flashes of the forensic cameras strobed in the darkness, the true scale of the horror became undeniable. This wasn't just about California in 1990. This was a roadmap of a predator's odyssey. Tucked inside an old cigar box were pieces of jewelry that had been reported missing in 3 different states. A locket from a 1988 disappearance in Oregon, a hair ribbon from a 1994 case in Arizona. The cold case files across the country were suddenly catching fire, as the name Arthur Vance began to link together a chain of tragedies that had long been thought unrelated. The shock that had gripped the local community was now a national tremor. The man who fixed fences and mowed lawns had been a ghost moving through the shadows of the American suburbs for decades, leaving a trail of broken families and empty bedrooms in his wake. The discovery of the hidden chamber turned the investigation into a race against time and biology. Every surface in that room was a treasure trove of microscopic evidence. Technicians painstakingly lifted hairs from the foam padding and scraped DNA from the rusted metal restraints bolted to the floor. Outside, the media circus had reached a fever pitch. News vans choked the cul-de-sac, their satellite dishes pointing toward the sky like accusing fingers. Reporters spoke in hushed, urgent tones about the house of horrors that had been hiding in plain sight. The contrast was sickening, the sun-drenched, palm-fringed California street on the outside, and the cold, dark, windowless tomb on the inside. It was a physical manifestation of Arthur Vance himself, a bright, pleasant exterior concealing a hollowed-out core of absolute darkness. But as the evidence mounted, so did the questions. How had he done it? How had a man who lived such a public, helpful life maintain a secret this vast, without a single slip-up? The ledger provided a chilling answer. Vance didn't just hide his crimes. He integrated them into his daily routine. He would kidnap a child in the morning and attend a neighborhood watch meeting in the evening, using the information he gathered from the police to refine his methods. He was a predator who studied his prey and his pursuers with equal intensity. The cold case wasn't a failure of the police. It was a masterpiece of deception by a man who understood that the best way to hide a body is to stand right on top of it and offer to help look. The hidden room was his sanctuary, the only place where he could truly be himself, surrounded by the ghosts of the lives he had stolen, while the world outside continued to call him a friend. The transition from the physical world of hidden rooms to the ethereal realm of the digital age was where the investigators expected the trail to go cold. Yet it was precisely where Arthur Vance's meticulous mask began to crack under the weight of his own arrogance. As the forensic team dismantled the hardware found in his study, a beige, hulking tower from the mid-90s sitting alongside a modern, sleek laptop, they realized they weren't just looking at a computer. They were looking at a digital confessional. In the early days of the internet, when the World Wide Web was a frontier of dial-up tones and lawless chat rooms, Vance had found a new hunting ground. He wasn't just a predator in the physical cul-de-sacs of California. He was a pioneer of the dark web before the term even existed. He moved through the primitive forums of the 1990s with the same calculated trusted neighbor persona. But here, the persona was a predatory ghost, a phantom lurking in the flickering shadows of green text monitors and unmoderated message boards. The digital deep dive revealed a chilling pattern of behavior that spanned 3 decades of technological evolution. Under the pseudonym found_neighbor_90, Vance had frequented early news groups and IRC channels, often inserting himself into discussions about unsolved disappearances, including Chloe Henderson's. To the other users, he seemed like a concerned citizen, a man obsessed with justice, sharing theories that were actually veiled boasts. He would describe the potential movements of the killer with a precision that should have been impossible, cloaking his intimate knowledge of the crime in the guise of an armchair detective. He was playing a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek with the world, hiding his truth in plain sight on the very platforms meant to connect humanity. The cold case wasn't just a file in a drawer. It was a living, breathing narrative that Vance curated online, feeding his ego with every like or reply from people who had no idea they were chatting with a murderer. As the 2000s dawned and the internet became a ubiquitous force, Vance's digital footprint grew more sophisticated and more sinister. He didn't just watch. He began to interact with the families of the victims through anonymous accounts. He would send tips that led nowhere or offer sympathy that was laced with subtle, psychological cruelty. The investigators found archived emails sent to the Hendersons 5 years after Chloe vanished, messages from a well-wisher suggesting she might still be alive in another state, keeping their hope alive just so he could watch it slowly starve. This was the true dark secret finally revealed. Vance didn't just want to kill. He wanted to own the aftermath. He thrived on the lingering agony of the community, using the internet as a remote control for the trauma he had initiated in that quiet California suburb. Every message was a needle, every post a twist of the knife, all while he lived a block away, offering to mow their lawn and asking if they'd heard any news. The sheer volume of data was staggering. Hundreds of gigabytes of encrypted files, hidden behind layers of obsolete security, contained a digital trophy room that mirrored the physical one in his closet. There were scanned newspaper clippings of every cold case he was suspected of, annotated with his own commentary in the margins. He had created a digital map of his own atrocities, a constellation of pain that stretched across the West Coast. The shock of the physical evidence was now compounded by the realization that Vance had spent hours every night, for decades, reliving his crimes through a keyboard. He was a digital voyeur of his own destruction, The investigators found evidence that he had even attempted to hack into the police department's internal servers in the late 2000s. Desperate to know if the cold case task force was getting any closer to the truth. His obsession with his own legend was the very thing that began to provide the breadcrumbs for his downfall. But the most disturbing discovery came from a hidden folder titled Projects. Inside were thousands of photos taken from a distance. Photos of local children at the park, at school bus stops, at the grocery store. He hadn't stopped hunting. He had just become more cautious, using digital zoom and long-range lenses to maintain his trusted neighbor facade while feeding his impulses from a distance. The cold case, solved in 2024, likely prevented a dozen more from beginning. The timeline was a relentless march of predatory intent, showing that Vance's appetite for control had only sharpened with age. He was a man who lived in a state of perpetual preparation, his digital life a blueprint for a violence that he managed to keep just beneath the surface of his respectable suburban existence. The arrest didn't just stop a killer, it shut down a one-man psychological warfare unit that had been targeting the innocent for half a century. As the sun rose over the digital forensics lab, the team realized they weren't just closing one case. They were dismantling a life built on a foundation of absolute, calculated malice. Arthur Vance wasn't just a trusted neighbor with a dark secret. He was the architect of misery who had utilized every tool of the modern age to protect his ancient, primal evil. The cold case was a misnomer. It had been burning hot in the mind of the killer every single day since 1990. The final piece of the digital puzzle was a video file, dated just days before his arrest. It was a recording of a neighborhood meeting where Vance was seen standing at the podium, speaking about the need for better street lighting to keep our children safe. The irony was a physical blow to the investigators. He was the darkness they were trying to light up, the wolf leading the sheep to the slaughter, the man who had turned a community's trust into his own personal shield. The fluorescent lights of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit do not illuminate. They dissect. In a sterile room thousands of miles from the California sun, a team of seasoned profilers stared at the surveillance footage of Arthur Vance, trying to reconcile the trusted neighbor with the archival evidence of a predator. This was the fifth stage of the descent into the abyss, the psychological autopsy of a living ghost. The cold case had transitioned from a forensic puzzle to a psychological war zone. The analysts didn't see a frail old man. They saw a master of the mask of sanity, a term coined to describe the high-functioning sociopath who blends so seamlessly into the fabric of society that he becomes invisible. Vance hadn't just evaded capture. He had engineered a reality where capture was a conceptual impossibility. To the world, he was a pillar. To the profilers, he was a black hole with a human face, a void that had spent 34 years consuming the light of everyone around him. The lead profiler noted the way Vance sat in the interrogation chair, back straight, hands folded, a posture of wounded dignity. It was a performance perfected over decades. He wasn't mimicking innocence, he was weaponizing it. Every blink, every tilt of the head, every sigh was a calculated move in a grand game of social chess. The dark secret wasn't just the crime itself, it was the fact that Vance felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no remorse, no fear. The behavioral report described him as a social engineer of trauma, a man who didn't just kill for the act of killing, but for the power granted him over the survivors. He was a narcissist who fed on the collective grief of the California cul-de-sac, drinking in the tears of the Hendersons like a parasite. The shock to the community wasn't just that he was a killer, but that every kind word he had ever spoken was a tactical strike designed to keep his hunters at bay. As the analysts dug deeper into his childhood and his early adult years, they found the blueprint for the monster. There were no outbursts, no red flags, no typical signs of a burgeoning killer. Instead, there was a chillingly consistent pattern of observation. Vance had spent his youth watching people the way a biologist watches a lab rat. He learned the mechanics of empathy without ever feeling it. He realized early on that if you offer to help, people stop looking at you. If you weep with them, they stop suspecting you. The cold case was the result of a man who had turned human emotion into a camouflage suit. He had chosen the most mundane, most trusted role, the handyman neighbor, because it gave him total access and zero visibility. He was the man who had the keys to everyone's house because everyone believed he was the one keeping them safe. The interrogation tapes revealed a breakthrough that sent a shiver through the BU team. When the lead detective mentioned the specific way Chloe's bicycle had been positioned, Vance's pupils didn't dilate with fear. They flared with pride. For a fleeting microsecond, the kind old man mask slipped and the predator peered through. He wasn't ashamed of the dark secret. He was frustrated that the world had taken 34 years to appreciate his work. To Vance, the cold case wasn't a crime to be hidden, but a masterpiece to be admired. He had kept Chloe's memory alive in the neighborhood, not out of a sense of twisted loyalty, but because he wanted to keep the wound open. He was a gardener of misery, pruning the grief of his neighbors to ensure it never fully healed, ensuring that the shadow of 1990 never truly left the California sun. The psychological profile painted a picture of a man who was dangerously normal. He had married, he had worked, he had paid his taxes. He was the trusted neighbor who never missed a Sunday service. Yet he carried the weight of a dozen murders in his pocket like spare change. The profilers concluded that Vance represented the most dangerous type of offender, the one who genuinely believes his own lie. By the time the DNA caught up to him, Vance had spent so long playing the part of the grieving neighbor that had almost convinced himself he was one of the victims. This was the ultimate betrayal. The realization that the man who had comforted a shattered community was actually the one who had shattered it, and he had enjoyed every second of the comforting as much as he had enjoyed the shattering. The cold case, solved in 2024, wasn't just a victory for science. It was a devastating revelation about the limits of human intuition. The FBI report ended with a chilling warning. Arthur Vance was not an anomaly. He was a reminder that the person you trust the most is the one with the best opportunity to destroy you. The dark secret, finally revealed, was a mirror held up to the community, showing them how easily their kindness had been used as a weapon against them. As the profile was finalized, the detectives realized they weren't just dealing with a murderer from 1990. They were dealing with a ghost who had spent a lifetime haunting the living while sitting right next to them at the dinner table. The shock was no longer about the arrest. It was about the realization that the neighborly smile they had relied on for 34 years was the last thing Chloe Henderson had ever seen. The investigation's reach began to expand beyond the physical walls of the hidden room and the digital corridors of the web, moving into the hazy, repressed memories of those who had grazed the edges of Arthur Vance's darkness and survived. These were the lost witnesses, the children of the 90s, now adults, who carried unexplained scars of intuition they had long dismissed as childhood paranoia. As news of the California 1990 cold case arrest saturated the airwaves, the police tip line didn't just ring, it screamed. Stories began to emerge of a trusted neighbor who was always just a little too present, a man whose kindness felt like a velvet glove over a claw. One woman, now a mother of 3, recounted a summer afternoon in 1992 when Vance had offered to show her a secret garden behind his tool shed. She had felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, a primal warning that sent her running back to her porch. For 30 years, she felt guilty for being rude to the nice man next door. Now, she realized she had been running for her life. The dark secret was a tapestry of near misses and narrow escapes that the community had collectively ignored because they couldn't conceive of a monster in their midst. The detectives began to map these encounters, creating a predatory shadow that followed Vance's movements through the decades. They found a pattern of grooming the neighborhood. Small favors, free repairs, and constant surveillance disguised as concern. He would fix a fence not to be helpful, but to ensure he knew the layout of a backyard. He would offer to pet sit not out of love for animals, but to gain access to the keys of a home. Every act of service was a reconnaissance mission. The cold case wasn't a singular event. It was the inevitable explosion of a pressure cooker that Vance had been stoking for years. The shock to the community deepened as they realized how many near misses had occurred right under their noses, how many of their children had been in his crosshairs. One of the most chilling testimonies came from a former police officer who had lived 3 doors down from Vance in the early 2000s. He remembered Vance as the man who always brought over extra firewood in the winter, the man who was obsessed with home security. Vance would spend hours discussing the dangers of the world with the officer, fishing for information on how the police tracked kidnappers, what kind of evidence they looked for, and how cold cases were prioritized. The officer realized with a sickening jolt that he had been a private tutor to a killer, providing Vance with the very knowledge he used to refine his camouflage. The trusted neighbor had used the law to learn how to break it perfectly. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a crime of professional-grade evasion, a dark secret protected by the very people sworn to uncover it. As these stories coalesced, the investigation turned toward a specific, forgotten incident in 1997. A young boy had claimed a man with a van had tried to lure him away with the promise of a lost puppy. The description of the man had been vague, and the trusted neighbor, Arthur Vance, had been the first one on the scene to comfort the boy and tell the police he had seen a suspicious green sedan speeding away in the opposite direction. The police had chased the ghost car for weeks, never realizing the predator was standing right behind them, holding the boy's hand. The cold case file was now being rewritten in real time, as the green sedan was revealed to be a total fabrication, a piece of counterintelligence planted by a master manipulator to lead the hounds away from his own scent. The shock was no longer just about the murder of Chloe. It was about the total subversion of the justice system by a man who treated the community like his own personal stage. The lost witnesses provided something DNA couldn't: the emotional weight of a lifetime of fear. They spoke of the Vance stare, that split second when his eyes would go flat and lifeless before the friendly crinkle returned. They spoke of the way he seemed to know things he shouldn't, like which parents were working late or which houses had faulty window locks. The dark secret finally revealed was that the neighborhood had been an open book to him, and he had been reading it page by page, deciding who lived and who became a cold case. The realization that their lives had been a game of chance for 34 years sent a new wave of trauma through the California suburb. The sun-drenched streets felt cold, the palm trees looked like skeletal remains, and every friendly wave from a neighbor was now viewed through a lens of suspicion. The final witness to come forward was a woman who had worked as a housekeeper for Vance briefly in the late 90s. She remembered a door in the basement that was always locked, a door he told her led to a sensitive wood shop where he kept dangerous chemicals. She recalled the metallic, sweet smell that occasionally drifted from the vents, a smell she thought was with stain or varnish. Now, she knew it was the scent of a cold case that had been waiting to be defrosted. Her testimony was the final nail in the coffin of his kind old man persona. The dark secret wasn't just hidden, it was aired out, right under the noses of everyone who thought they knew him. The shock was total, a complete collapse of the communal psyche, as they realized that the monster wasn't hiding in the woods. He was the one who had been invited to their dinner tables, the one they had trusted with their children, and the one they had called a friend. The leather-bound volume found in the breathless silence of the hidden chamber wasn't just a book. It was a grimoire of the mundane turned macabre. When the lead detective, wearing latex gloves that felt too thin to protect against the evil radiating from the pages, finally cracked the spine, the smell of mildew and old tobacco hit him first. But it was the ink, faded blue ballpoint turning gray with age, that held the weight of 100 nightmares. The Vance ledger didn't begin with Chloe Henderson in 1990. The first entry was dated nearly 2 decades earlier, in the hazy, heat-struck summer of 1974. The cold case of the California cul-de-sacs was merely the final chapter of a story that had been written across state lines, through the eras of bell-bottoms and disco, long before Arthur Vance ever put on the mask of the trusted neighbor. The entries were terrifying not for their chaos, but for their order. Vance was a draftsman by trade, a man of lines and angles, and he applied that same clinical precision to the destruction of human life. There were no frantic scribbles or raving manifestos here. Instead, there were columns: date, time, location, subject. The early entries detailed a period of transient violence. Hitchhikers picked up on lonely stretches of Nevada highway, runaways vanishing from bus stations in Oregon. He referred to them not by name, but by characteristics: the hiker, the drifter, the girl with the red scarf. He treated abduction like a logistical challenge, noting the transit time and disposal sites with the casual indifference of a trucker logging his miles. The dark secret was that Vance hadn't just been hiding a murder, he had been hiding a career. As the investigators turned the pages, the geography of his horror contracted. In the 70s and 80s, he was a shark in open water, moving constantly, never striking the same place twice. But as the dates approached 1990, the pattern shifted. The entries became less frequent, but more detailed. He was settling down. He was buying the house on Oak Street. He was building the trusted neighbor persona, not as a way to stop, but as a way to hunt closer to home without getting caught. The ledger revealed the terrifying logic behind this transition. He was tired of the road. He wanted a controlled environment. The cold case of Chloe Henderson was marked in the book simply as Project Local. It was a test of his new camouflage, a gamble to see if he could take a life within shouting distance of his own front door and remain invisible. The specific entry for that Tuesday, in June 1990, was a masterclass in dissociation. He didn't write about the fear in the child's eyes or the panic of the community. He wrote about the sight lines from his kitchen window. He critiqued his own performance, noting that the approach was clean but the timing was tight. He graded himself on the efficiency of the abduction, awarding himself high marks for the diversion he created by joining the search party immediately after. To read the ledger was to stare directly into the sun of his narcissism. He viewed the police investigation not as a threat, but as a performance review. The shock for the detectives was realizing that while they were losing sleep over a missing girl, Vance was in his study, calmly documenting his success, like a gardener noting a particularly good harvest. The ledger also solved cold cases that no one even knew existed. In the margins of a 1985 entry, he sketched a map of a ravine in Northern California where he had left the runner. Police had found remains there years ago, unidentified and forgotten, labeled a John Doe. Now that Doe had a killer. The book connected the dots between scattered bones and missing persons reports that had gathered dust in basements from Sacramento to Seattle. Vance had been a one-man epidemic of disappearances, a ghost who slipped through the cracks of a pre-digital law enforcement system that couldn't talk to each other across county lines. The dark secret was a structural failure of justice, exploited by a man who understood exactly where the blind spots were. But the most haunting aspect of the ledger was the blank pages at the end. After 1990, the entries stopped being about abductions and started being about surveillance. The hunger hadn't left him. It had just changed shape. He listed the names of neighborhood children born in the 90s and 2000s, tracking their routines, their schools, their vulnerabilities. He was aging, his physical strength waning. So he had moved from the active hunt to the fantasy of the hunt. The cold case resolution saved the community from a monster who was technically retired but mentally active. He was planning, waiting, perhaps hoping for one last opportunity to fill a final page. The trusted neighbor died on paper the moment that ledger was found, replaced by the reality of a predator who had turned the American dream into a filing system for the dead. The weight of the book was physical evidence, but its contents were a psychological nuclear bomb. It rewrote history. The quiet decades in the neighborhood weren't peaceful. They were a holding pattern. The shock that reverberated through the families mentioned in those earlier pages was a fresh trauma, a wound ripped open after 40 years. They finally had answers, but the answers came from the pen of a man who wrote about their loved ones as if they were inventory. As the ledger was bagged and tagged, a silence fell over the evidence room, a heavy, suffocating acknowledgement that while the cold case was solved, the true extent of Arthur Vance's darkness was a bottomless well that they had only just begun to fathom. The courtroom in downtown Sacramento was a sterile box of polished wood and fluorescent judgment, a far cry from the sun-drenched streets where Arthur Vance had played the role of the benevolent patriarch for 34 years. But the air inside was thick, charged with a collective breath held by 3 generations of a community that had come to see the face of their betrayal. When the bailiff announced the entry of the defendant, the room didn't gasp, it froze. Vance shuffled in, leaning heavily on a cane, his silver hair combed neatly, wearing a cardigan that looked like it belonged in a Werther's original commercial. To the uninitiated, he was a frail grandfather confused by the fuss. To the people of the Oak Street cul-de-sac, he was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and the sheep had finally come to bear witness. The prosecution began their opening statement not with a shout, but with a whisper, a recitation of the timeline that had been reconstructed from the Vance ledger. They projected images of the evidence, the blue bicycle, the hidden room, the faded Polaroids. The cold case wasn't presented as a mystery anymore. It was an anatomy of malice. The district attorney, a woman who had been in kindergarten when Chloe disappeared, spoke with a controlled fury, peeling back the layers of the dark secret, one by one. She described how Vance had attended the vigils, how he had brought casserole to the Hendersons, how he had used their grief as a shield. The shock in the gallery was palpable, a physical wave of nausea as neighbors realized that the hand they had shaken was the same hand that had turned the lock on a soundproof cell. But the true horror of the day wasn't the evidence. It was the reaction of the man sitting at the defense table. For hours, Vance sat motionless, his expression one of polite boredom, as if he were waiting for a bus rather than a life sentence. His defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer with the weary look of a man pushing a boulder up a hill, tried to paint a picture of a senile old man, a hoarder whose mind had wandered into fantasy. He argued that the ledger was a work of fiction, a delusion of a lonely mind. That was the moment the mask slipped. It wasn't a dramatic outburst. It was a subtle, terrifying correction. As the lawyer suggested that Vance imagine the details of the 1990 abduction, Vance leaned over and whispered something into the microphone that picked up clearly in the hushed room. The bike was in 3rd gear, not 2nd. The silence that followed was deafening. It was a specific, technical detail that only the person who wrote it, or the person who stopped it, would know. The trusted neighbor had just confirmed his guilt not with a confession, but with a correction born of arrogance. He couldn't stand to have his work misrepresented, even if it meant saving his own skin. The cold case was his masterpiece, and he refused to let anyone smudge the details. The judge stared at him, the stenographer's fingers hovered over the keys, and the jury looked at him with the dawn of absolute horror. He wasn't confused. He wasn't senile. He was proud. Vance's eyes, previously dim and watery, suddenly sharpened, scanning the faces in the gallery with a predatory recognition. He locked eyes with Chloe's younger brother, now a grown man, and offered a small, tight nod, a gesture of acknowledgement between old acquaintances. It was a psychological gut punch, a reminder that he still held power. He was signaling that he remembered everything. The tears, the desperate searches, the years of hope he had allowed them to have. The dark secret wasn't just that he killed, it was that he enjoyed the long game. He had fed on their hope for decades, and now, in this courtroom, he was feeding on their despair. The prosecutor seized the moment, abandoning her prepared notes to ask him directly if he wanted to address the court. Vance declined to take the stand, but his silence was louder than any scream. He sat back, adjusted his glasses, and returned to his posture of the benign retiree. But the room had changed. The atmosphere shifted from a legal proceeding to a confrontation with pure evil. The shock of the arrest had faded into a cold, hard dread. The community realized that there would be no remorse, no tearful apology, no explanation of why. To Arthur Vance, they were just characters in a story, and he was simply annoyed that the final chapter was being written by someone else. As the day's session ended and Vance was led away, the clinking of his cane against the floor echoed like the ticking of a clock that had finally stopped. The cold case was legally solved, but the emotional wound was ripped wide open. The families left the courthouse not with a sense of closure, but with the haunting image of that small, tight nod. The trusted neighbor was gone, replaced by a monster who treated murder like a technical skill to be perfected. And as the heavy oak doors swung shut, the lingering feeling in the air was that Arthur Vance wasn't trapped in there with the law. The law was trapped in there with him. The courtroom outburst didn't just seal Arthur Vance's fate. It turned the quiet cul-de-sac into a global amphitheater of the macabre. The cold case was no longer a local tragedy. It was a streaming sensation, a hashtag, a spectacle devoured by a world hungry for the anatomy of a monster. The satellite trucks multiplied, their dishes turning to follow the sun like a field of mechanical sunflowers, beaming the image of Vance's modest ranch house to millions of screens. True crime tourists began to drive slowly past the property, filming TikToks in front of the yellow police tape, treating the site of a child's abduction like a grim roadside attraction. The shock of the community had curdled into a weary, buzzing irritation. They were no longer just victims, they were content. And in the middle of this chaotic circus, a high-budget documentary crew arrived, not just to report the news, but to find the story that the police, in their rush to close the file, had missed. This wasn't a local news team with a handheld camera. This was a production unit with cinema-grade lenses, drone operators, and a team of researchers who treated the past like an archaeological dig. They were looking for the angle, the cinematic hook that would elevate the California 1990 cold case from a headline to a legacy. They set up shop in a rented house across the street, turning their lens on the neighborhood itself, interviewing the residents who were now weary of the spotlight. But the real work was happening in the editing bay, a dark room lit only by the glow of monitors where a young researcher was tasked with digitizing and scrubbing through hundreds of hours of home videos provided by the neighbors. Birthdays, 4th of July block parties, mundane weekends from the late 80s that had been collecting dust in attics for decades. It was in the grain of a Super 8 film reel, dated Labor Day 1989, that The Dark Secret whispered its final, most terrifying verse. The footage was innocent enough on the surface. Fathers grilling burgers, mothers laughing with wine coolers in hand, children running through sprinklers in a haze of golden light. But the researcher, bleary-eyed at 3 a.m., noticed a figure in the deep background of the frame. It was Arthur Vance. He wasn't mingling. He wasn't eating. He was standing by the fence line, perfectly still, watching the children play. The researcher hit pause, zoomed in, enhanced the grainy image. Vance wasn't just watching. He was holding a clipboard, and in his other hand a stopwatch. The documentary crew realized with a jolt of adrenaline that they weren't looking at a neighbor enjoying a party. They were looking at a scientist collecting data. Vance was timing the children. He was measuring how long it took for a parent to look away, how long it took for a child to cycle from one driveway to the next. The trusted neighbor was conducting a time and motion study of abduction. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a crime of mathematical probability, calculated months in advance. But the film held a second, even more disturbing detail. As the camera panned to follow a dog running across the yard, Vance could be seen briefly turning away, kneeling down near the base of the massive oak tree that separated his property from the Hendersons. He was burying something. Not a body, it was too small. A jar. A box. A time capsule of intent. The crew didn't sleep. They cross-referenced the location of the tree with the current crime scene photos. The police had dug up the basement, the flower beds, the shed, but they hadn't touched the roots of the ancient oak, assuming the ground there was too hard, too undisturbed. The documentary director, sensing the scoop of a lifetime, made the call to the lead detective. The skepticism on the other end of the line was palpable, but the visual evidence was undeniable. Within hours, the circus shifted. The excavators returned, this time focusing on the gnarled roots of the tree that had stood as a silent witness to the entire tragedy. The shock of the discovery was about to be eclipsed by the contents of the earth. As the heavy machinery clawed at the soil, the documentary cameras rolled, capturing the moment a rusted, metal ammunition box was pulled from the tangle of roots. It had been sealed with wax and wrapped in heavy plastic, preservation tactics of a man who intended for it to last. The bomb squad was called as a precaution, but the cold case, experts knew better. This wasn't an explosive, it was a narrative. When the lid was finally pried open, the smell of stale air and old paper drifted out. Inside, there were no trophies, no jewelry. There was a single leather-bound notebook and a set of architectural blueprints. The blueprints were of the neighborhood, but they weren't standard property maps. Vance had drawn them himself. He had marked blind spots, areas where no window from any house faced. He had drawn escape vectors, lines showing the quickest route to the highway from every single driveway. He had calculated the response time of the local patrol cars based on his own observations. The dark secret was that Vance had turned the entire suburb into a tactical grid. He knew the neighborhood better than the architects who designed it. He knew exactly where a scream would be muffled by the hedges, exactly where a shadow would be deepest at 6 p.m. in June. But the notebook was the true revelation. It wasn't a diary of past crimes. It was a manifesto of future ones. Titled The Vulnerability Assessment, it contained profiles not just of Chloe, but of every child on the block in 1990. He had listed their compliance levels, their fear triggers, and their parental attachment styles. He had predicted who would run, who would freeze, and who would fight. The entry for Chloe Henderson was chilled by its accuracy. Subject is trusting, responds to authority figures. Route home is consistent. Optimal window, 18 to 18:15. The documentary crew filmed the pages as the detectives' hands shook. This was proof that the cold case was never an accident. It was a targeted extraction, executed with the precision of a military operation. The final page of the notebook contained a single, cryptic phrase that sent a chill through everyone present. The garden is only the beginning. The seeds are planted. It was a metaphor that the police initially dismissed as the rambling of a psychopath. But the documentary researcher, still thinking about the stopwatch, realized it might be literal. They scanned the ground again with ground-penetrating radar, widening the search radius beyond the tree. The screen lit up with anomalies. Not one box, 5, buried at the four corners of his property, and one in the center. Vance had planted caches of evidence, journals, and perhaps even biological material, anchoring his darkness into the very land itself. The shock that rippled through the media was absolute. The trusted neighbor hadn't just hidden a room, he had weaponized the earth. The documentary crew's discovery rewrote the entire understanding of the offender. He wasn't a lonely predator. He was a terraformer of terror, embedding his legacy into the soil so deep that to remove it would be to destroy the land itself. The neighborhood wasn't just a crime scene. It was a graveyard of potential futures, mapped and modeled by a man who saw children not as people, but as variables in a cruel equation. As the sun set over the excavation site, the lights of the documentary cameras illuminated the deep, dark holes in the ground, looking like open wounds in the suburban lawn, proving that some secrets don't just die, they wait to be dug up. The scene under the glare of the industrial floodlights wasn't an investigation anymore. It was an archaeological dig into the bedrock of hell. The California night, usually cooling and serene, was choked with the diesel fumes of excavators and the thick, humid tension of a community watching its own autopsy. The trusted neighbor's garden, once the envy of the block with its manicured hedges and prize-winning roses, was now a cratered moonscape of raw earth and exposed roots. The documentary crew's discovery of the first box had triggered a frenzy, but as the heavy machinery pulled the second, third, and fourth ammunition cases from the clay, the silence that fell over the site was heavier than the dirt itself. These weren't just containers, they were time capsules of a contagion. The cold case of Chloe Henderson was rapidly mutating from a singular tragedy into a sprawling, multi-state epidemic. When the bomb squad technicians finally gave the all-clear, the lead detective knelt in the mud, his movements slow, almost reverent, terrified of what the dark secret would whisper next. Box number 2 didn't contain weapons or trophies. It contained paper, reams of it, preserved in vacuum-sealed bags. The pages were crisp, the ink unfaded. As the forensic team began to catalog the contents under the harsh white light of the mobile command tent, the blood drained from their faces. These weren't journals. They were letters. Hundreds of them. The return addresses were a rogues gallery of maximum security prisons across the country. Arthur Vance, the kind old man who waved at school buses, had been a pen pal to some of the most notorious monsters in American history. But he wasn't a fanboy seeking autographs. The tone of the letters made that sickeningly clear. He was a peer, a consultant. The shock that rippled through the command tent was physical. Vance had been critiquing them. In neat professorial handwriting, he offered constructive feedback on their crimes, pointing out tactical errors in abduction sites, disposal methods, and media management. He treated the cold case files of other killers as case studies, dissecting their failures with the arrogance of a master surgeon lecturing clumsy interns. He chided one infamous Midwest strangler for lacking patience and advised another on the East Coast that his pattern was too predictable. The trusted neighbor had been running a correspondence course in evasion from his kitchen table, sipping coffee while grading the homework of psychopaths. The revelation was nauseating. Vance wasn't just hiding in the shadows. He was trying to optimize them. But it was the third box that turned the investigation from a historical review into an active emergency. This box contained letters from people who were not in prison, people with no names, only handles and P.O. boxes in obscure towns. Apprentice, student, watcher. These were the ones Vance was mentoring in real time. The dark secret exploded outward as the detectives read correspondence dating from the late 90s to as recently as a month before his arrest. These weren't just fantasies. They were operational plans. Vance was coaching a new generation. He advised a student in Ohio on how to select a vehicle that blends into a rural environment. He instructed a watcher in Florida on the importance of befriending the local police force to monitor the temperature of an investigation. The cold case unit realized with dawning horror that they weren't just looking at the past. They were looking at the blueprints for current and future crimes. Vance had codified his trusted neighbor, camouflage, into a curriculum. He taught them that the best weapon wasn't a gun or a knife, but a smile and a lawnmower. Be the one they call when the power goes out. He wrote in a chilling manifesto titled The Art of the Open Door. Be the one who brings the casserole. Visibility is the ultimate invisibility. The shock was absolute. The man they had arrested wasn't a lone wolf. He was a pack leader who had never left his den. The implications were catastrophic. Every cold case in the country now had to be re-examined through the lens of Vance's influence. Was that unsolved disappearance in Texas a copycat? Was that abduction in Maine a final exam? The fourth box was the insurance policy. It contained detailed maps, not of California, but of other suburbs and other states. Marked on these maps were houses, parks, and schools, annotated with the same clinical precision Vance had used on Chloe Henderson. But these weren't his targets. They were the targets of his students. He had kept collateral. If any of his protégés ever got caught and tried to give him up, Vance had the evidence to bury them first. It was a network held together by mutually assured destruction. The dark secret was a web of blackmail and blood that stretched from coast to coast. The police found photos in this box, surveillance shots of children in towns thousands of miles away, sent to Vance as proof of progress by his acolytes. As the news of the network broke, the media frenzy transformed into a national panic. The shock was no longer contained to the Oak Street cul-de-sac. It was in every living room in America. Parents looked at their own trusted neighbors with sudden, sharp suspicion. The nice guy who fixed the bikes? The quiet lady who walked the dogs? Vance had weaponized the very concept of community. He had proven that the monster doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, he looks like a mentor. The FBI stepped in, initiating a massive, coordinated sweep of the P.O. boxes and digital drops mentioned in the letters. The cold case of 1990 had become the Rosetta Stone for a dark underworld of predatory grooming that had gone unnoticed for 30 years. In an interrogation room, Vance sat with the same eerie calm, watching the chaos unfold on the muted TV in the corner. When the detectives slammed the photos of the students on the table, demanding names, Vance didn't flinch. He just smiled, that same, thin, grandfatherly smile that had fooled the world. "I didn't make them," he said softly, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering on pavement. "I just organized them. Talent needs direction." The arrogance was breathtaking. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as an educator, a pioneer who had professionalized the chaotic impulses of lesser men. The cold case wasn't a burden to him. It was his credentials. The investigation quickly identified 3 active students based on the maps in the 4th box. SWAT teams were mobilized in 3 different time zones. The shock of the raids was broadcast live. Suburban houses just like Vance's, raided in the pre-dawn light, neighbors standing on their lawns in bathrobes, mirroring the scene in California. In one house in Denver, they found a basement that was a near replica of Vance's, down to the soundproofing foam. The dark secret was a franchise. Vance had successfully replicated his method, creating clones of his own darkness, who were operating with the same terrifying efficiency. The cold case, solved in California, had potentially stopped a dozen more from ever happening. But the question remained, how many others were out there? How many students had graduated and cut ties, operating now with the skills Vance had taught them, invisible and deadly? The 5th box, the one buried deepest under the taproot of the oak, was the final blow. It didn't contain letters or maps. It contained money, gold coins, stacks of cash, and fake identifications. This was the escape plan he never used. But tucked into the cash was a single VHS tape, labeled Legacy. The detectives found an old VCR, their hands trembling as they pushed the tape in. The grainy footage showed Vance, younger, standing in his living room. He was speaking directly to the camera, directly to the future. "If you are watching this," he said, "then I am caught. But do not worry. The garden is self-seating." He then began to list names, not of victims, but of law enforcement officers, judges, and reporters he had compromised or manipulated over the years. People he had fed false leads to, people he had charmed, people whose incompetence he had exploited. The tape was a final act of psychological warfare. He was burning the ground behind him, sowing distrust within the very institutions meant to stop him. The trusted neighbor was dismantling the system from the inside out. Even in defeat, the cold case had been solved, but the victory fell hollow, filled with the ash of a reality that was far darker than anyone had dared to imagine. As the sun rose over the excavated garden, the holes in the ground looked less like evidence pits and more like open graves for the peace of mind of an entire nation. The shock had evolved into a permanent scar. Arthur Vance was in handcuffs, but his shadow had just gotten infinitely longer, stretching across the map, darkening doorways in towns that had never even heard his name until today. The gavel didn't bang. It fell with the heavy, final thud of a coffin lid closing. In the same Sacramento courtroom where Arthur Vance had once sat as a spectator to his own life, he now stood, stooped, gray, and utterly unrepentant, to hear the state of California pronounce him a dead man walking. The sentencing hearing was less a legal proceeding and more a public exorcism. The judge, a woman known for her steely reserve, looked down at the trusted neighbor, not with anger, but with a profound, weary disgust. She didn't offer him a lecture on morality. She knew, as everyone in that room knew, that Arthur Vance was beyond the reach of shame. When she read the sentence, consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 100 years for the specialized cruelties he had inflicted, Vance didn't flinch. He didn't weep. He simply adjusted his cardigan, checked his watch as if he had a bus to catch, and allowed the bailiffs to shackle him for the last time. The shock that had fueled the headlines for months had evaporated, replaced by a hollow, aching silence. As Vance was wheeled out of the courtroom, he offered one final, chilling interaction with the world he had deceived. He looked directly into the camera of the documentary crew that had unearthed his secrets, and for a split second, the kind old man mask dissolved completely. He winked. It was a gesture so small, yet so heavy with arrogance, that it sent a fresh wave of nausea through the millions watching at home. It was his way of saying that he had won, that for 34 years he had been the smartest person in the room, and a prison cell couldn't retroactively undo the decades of control he had exerted over an entire community. The cold case was closed, but the Vance legend was just beginning its dark afterlife in the annals of criminal history. But the story didn't end with the clanging of a cell door. It continued in the silence of the house on Oak Street. For weeks after the trial, the Vance residence stood like a tombstone in the middle of the suburbs. The police tape eventually rotted and fell away, but an invisible barrier remained. No one walked on the sidewalk in front of it. Birds seemed to avoid the ancient oak tree where the dark secrets had been buried. The grass, once manicured to a golf course perfection by Vance's own hands, grew wild and tall, choking the roses he had prized. The house began to die a physical death that mirrored the moral rot of its owner. Windows cracked without being touched. Shingles slid off the roof like shedding skin. It was as if the structure itself was trying to decompose, to return to the earth and hide the memories of what happened in the soundproof darkness of its core. The for sale sign never went up. Who would buy it? Who could sleep in a master bedroom that sat 10 feet above a torture chamber? The property became a macabre tourist attraction. Murder tourists would drive by slowly at night, their headlights sweeping over the darkened windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of a ghost. Teenagers dared each other to run up and touch the front door, fleeing in terror as if the wood itself burned. The trusted neighbor's sanctuary had become a jagged scar on the face of the neighborhood, a constant, physical reminder of the betrayal. The community meetings, once held to discuss block parties and neighborhood watch schedules, were now consumed by a singular, desperate question: how do we get rid of it? The decision was unanimous. The house had to go. It wasn't about property values. It was about spiritual hygiene. The city council, pushed by a petition signed by every single resident within a 3-mile radius, authorized the demolition. On a gray Tuesday morning, almost exactly 35 years after Chloe Henderson vanished, the bulldozers arrived. There was no ceremony. There were no speeches. The neighborhood came out to watch, standing in the same spots where they had once stood to search for a missing girl. The Hendersons were there, holding hands, their faces etched with the kind of grief that doesn't fade, but fossilizes. As the first claw of the excavator tore through the roof of the garage, a collective breath was released, a sound like a sigh from the very soul of the street. The destruction was violent and necessary. The machine chewed through the wood and stucco, exposing the skeletal frame of the house. When the walls of the hidden room were finally breached, the sunlight hit that dark space for the first time in decades. It looked small, pathetic, just plywood and foam. Stripped of Vance's presence, the lair was revealed for what it truly was: a dirty, cramped box built by a sad, small man. The dark secret lost its power as it was reduced to rubble. The neighbors watched as the Vance Ledger's birthplace was ground into dust, the debris loaded into dump trucks to be hauled away to a landfill in the desert, buried under tons of anonymous trash where it belonged. But as the trucks rumbled away, leaving behind a flat, empty lot of churned earth. The community realized that the shock of the demolition didn't bring the peace they had hoped for. The void was almost louder than the house had been. The empty space between the two neighboring homes looked like a missing tooth, a gap that could never be filled. The Hendersons stared at the patch of dirt where the oak tree had stood, knowing that the roots of the trauma went far deeper than the excavators could reach. The cold case was solved. The killer was caged. The house was gone. But the innocence of the neighborhood was gone too. They could pave over the lot, plant new grass, maybe even build a park, but they could never pave over the memory of the trusted neighbor who had smiled at them while he sharpened his knives. The legacy of Arthur Vance rippled out far beyond California. He changed the way a generation looked at their world. The Vance effect became a sociological phenomenon. Across the country, background checks for handymen and gardeners skyrocketed. Neighborhood watch apps saw a surge in users, but the tone had shifted from community building to paranoid surveillance. People stopped leaving spare keys under doormats. The concept of the friendly neighbor was tainted, replaced by a cautious, guarded politeness. Vance had stolen more than lives. He had stolen the fundamental American belief that you are safe in your own backyard. He had proven that the most dangerous place wasn't a dark alley in the city, but the sun-drenched lawn of the man who organizes the 4th of July barbecue. Inside the Supermax prison in Colorado, Arthur Vance became a celebrity of the worst kind. He received fan mail from the students he had never met, the dark network he had fostered. He spent his days in solitary confinement, writing new ledgers in his head, staring at the concrete wall with the same intensity he had once used to watch the children on Oak Street. He was the professor of the cell block, a man who had turned cold cases into a science. But stripped of his garden, his tools, and his control, he withered. The dark secret that had sustained him was out, and without the thrill of the deception, he was just an old man dying in a cage. He passed away 3 years into his sentence, alone, unmourned, his body unclaimed by any family, cremated and disposed of without a marker. A final, fitting erasure for a man who had tried to erase so many others. Back on Oak Street, the seasons changed. The raw earth of the empty lot was eventually covered by a memorial garden. Not for Vance, but for Chloe and the others. A single bench was placed there, facing the setting sun. The new families who moved and didn't know the full history. They only knew that the empty lot was a quiet place where the older residents sometimes sat, looking at nothing in particular. The shock had faded into folklore, a grim story told to warn children not to talk to strangers, even the ones who knew their names. The final image of this tragedy isn't the courtroom or the prison, or even the face of the killer. It is the image of that empty space where a house used to be. It stands as a scar on the landscape, a reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor, and while the grass has grown back, and the birds have returned to the trees, the silence on that block is different now. It is a vigilant silence, a silence that listens, a silence that knows that while the cold case is closed, the darkness is never truly gone. It just moves to a new street, puts on a new mask, and waits for someone to unlock the door.